into positions of hopelessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America. No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less than human. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.
Okay, what's up, fuckers? I've thrown the non-cursing out the window. Sorry. Hi, I'm Jake Flores, and joining me again is from Halal Cartels, Gabe Pacheco. Welcome back to the
Hey,
show.
what's up, everybody? What's up, fools?
What's up? What's up, fool? Yeah,
What's
let's
up,
just like
Cartel?
way overdo all this shit to try to remain on theme today.
Yeah.
I love like I mean, I like, you know, it's weird because as a comedian, sometimes you feel like, oh, am I overly cartoonifying like characters like that? Is it catering to like, you know, the white gaze or whatever? Is it, you know, am I having the problem that Dave Chappelle had where it's like overly, like selling out this stuff? But the thing is, like, I love the way cholos talk and like all the different kinds and stuff, and I love saying sup fucker to my friends every time I see them. When I was walking around here a while back in LA when I like first got out here, and I just like walked past a bunch of guys working on a construction thing, and they were like, they sounded so like, they just sounded like on the nose a fucking cartoon of a cholo, and they were having the best conversation I've ever heard in my life. They were going like, have you ever seen The Hangover, fool? And then the other guy was like, yeah, I liked it, but I didn't like that fucker Bradley Cooper. Like,
Yeah,
like,
man.
LA is so cool.
It's best. And like, you know, I was raised on the East Coast, Washington, D.C. And so whenever I go and I do shows out west, like when I meet my Mexican American brethren, mi gente, you know, la raza, the Chicanos out there spitting bars, they're like, hey, oh, they know my last name, you know, they're like, oh, Gabriel Pacheco, you know, but they immediately go, what are you, Puerto Rican? Because like my mannerisms are much more from like the East Coast, and it's just a faster patois, and like a much more, you know, it's around more Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and Salvadorians. But I was thinking about how I like learned about Cholo culture from Blood In, Blood Out. I feel
Hell
like that was mandatory to watch, especially when you're like in the diaspora, far away from like, you know, the heart and the center of Aslan.
It's, you have to connect to your roots, which is the movie Blood In, Blood Out. More than anything, it's like the Bible.
Do you remember Homies, those little toys?
Yeah, fuck yeah.
And again, Homies, like when you look at like the sort of a black-white kind of dichotomy, there's that you see these old banished racist figurines from like black culture, like mammies and like, or black and salt and pepper shakers, you know. But like when Homies came out, they could on one hand be seen as like a stereotypical like little toys, you know, but on the other hand, they were embraced by like so much of the Chicano community, right? It's like, hell yeah, I get to see myself represented as this like little figurine. And each homie had a backstory. So it was like the Smurfs, you know?
Yeah, you would get them in the little 25-cent quarter machine. Honestly, like, man, you just opened up a whole thing that I could, like a whole road I could go down, but that would be a different podcast. Because it's weird. There's a lot going on there where it's like, okay, for you to kind of indulge in this stuff, and then it's like, well, what perspective are we looking at it from? I thought about this a lot a while back. It never happened. I think we just fell out of communication, but I was going to do an episode with this show called The Horror Vanguard, who are friends of ours who
love
like
those guys.
Marxism and horror films and stuff. And we were going to talk about Leprechaun. And I started off like pitching this to them as a joke. And then the more I started watching the Leprechaun movies, I realized like, wait, there's something going on here that's kind of interesting with there's a book that I was going to tie it into called How the Irish Became White, which we've talked about on the show. But like the like caricature of the like like leprechaun, especially the way they're doing it over the top in those movies. You know, it's like this thing that if Irish people weren't white would be deeply offensive, and if there was not like a power dynamic, or if there was more of a power dynamic, it would be like a fucking minstrel show, but it's not. And anyways, you know what, I'm not gonna go off that hard because I think there's still a podcast here. Maybe I'll do it later this year. Maybe I'll follow up with those fuckers.
I mean, very quickly around all of this, we talked about it on part 1 about whiteness, and Anders, I think. This, I was listening to Bad Hasbara, and which I love, which is two sort of anti-Zionist, Jewish, very funny and artistic people. So shout outs to those guys. Matt
Lee, yeah, they're very funny.
And they brought up the idea of their guest was talking about sort of like an anti-racist white ally type group that he's part of, and sort of that he wanted white people to remember their culture, right? Not like Western Civ, but like remember where you came from, like your Irishness or your Germanness, or having pride in these very specific parts of yourself that kind of erase, because whiteness is like it's a fake construct or a social construct that exists in opposition to and within a hierarchy of like blackness. It makes blackness, it makes brownness, but none of those things are, obviously none of these things are real. Our identities are constructed, but I think a much more rich way to look at our identities is like not within this sort of like fake triumvirate of black, white, brown, but like, you know, white is the absence. It's all power, no flavor. And you know,
it's the hegemony. Like it's not just one of many things. It's everything exists in relation to it or whatever.
Right. And then the last thing that was that under equality, under true equality, these distinctions and differences among us would be acceptable to talk about, because now are not like acceptable to even joke about. You know, when we think about comics like Don Rickles, you know, there's this, oh, can you make fun of people? Can you make fun of yourself? Can other people make fun of you? Like, are the homies offensive? Right? They're offensive within the power structure of like white people adopting those homies and imbuing Chicanos or Mexicans with the stereotypes based on those toys. But when it is us making those toys and showing our own distinctions or sense of self creation, it's not offensive.
Yeah, and there's that even extends, I'd say, to like all the way to ideas about like nationalism and stuff like that. Like there's, I remember I had this this experience that I think about a lot years ago. It was a minor one-off conversation at a bar, but it stuck with me for a long time. And it was when I was hanging out with fucking really, really post-racial white edgelords because I was doing stand-up comedy. And I remember I was talking to a brown dude at a bar in Austin, and I was sort of making this argument that was like post-racial because I was really that was what really was going over in comedy at that point, was like, hey, you can laugh about everything. It's actually racist to not laugh about stuff, right? Kind of flattening everything out by using a skewed version of this logic that you're talking about that equates whiteness with all the other races as if it's like the triumvirate thing you're saying. And what I said to this guy was like, you know, I'm just meat. Like I'm not, I don't consider myself this or that or white or brown or whatever. Like I consider myself first and foremost. And, you know, it feels like the arguments that people make, you know, on the liberal side of things are often trying to push something onto me that I don't really, you know, that's not my decision. And the guy was like, no, you're not. Like, you don't get to decide what you are. And I was like, huh, like, that's a really interesting point. You do get to decide what you are up to a point, but like a lot of these things are decided for you by other people because your like identity, you know, exists. It doesn't matter what you think you are. You kind of, in certain ways, you are what society deems you. That's kind of where all these ideas come from. And I don't know. So just kind of went off from there. But another thing happened to me years ago. This is later on. This is like a couple years ago when I was bartending in New York, where I met these guys. I wish I could remember the name of their podcast, but I met this guy who lived in a neighborhood in Lower Manhattan, and was telling me about how him and his family have lived there for decades, and they're starting to get priced out. And he is like he's really smart Latin dude who had this intense podcast where like he was showing me it, but it's in Spanish, and it's like they go through like just a lot of Latin American history, probably the same stuff we're covering on some level. And he told me that he was approached at one point. He was like, I was approached by these two white women, and they really wanted to do an episode with them to collaborate. And then he looked into them and he realized that they kind of sucked. And so he turned them down. And those two white women were fucking Red Scare, because that neighborhood is now known as Dimes Square. It used to just be this dude's neighborhood, but now it's the epicenter of this like post-racial, like kind of, you know, fucking proto, what do you call it, crypto-fascist thing that came out of anti-woke, quote unquote, dirtbag left scene that all of this stuff is, you know, on some level connected to. But he told me something really interesting. We were talking about nationalism, and his pitch on it was like, the reason that those Red Scare girls approached him is because they really liked that their podcast had been dealing with and embracing nationalism, because those Red Scare girls are white nationalists, right? And they kind of see it as all nationalism is good. Whiteness is just one of the many, like you're saying. So it's good that you have this, like, you know, this, I can't remember what country they're from, but there's some, you know, some from somewhere in Latin America. Like, oh, it's good that you have this nationalism. And what he said is he realized as he was talking to them that it's good that it's good to have, the way he argued it is he was like, if you are from Latin American diaspora, it's actually good for you to have nationalism. It is not good for white people to have nationalism, because as a Latin American diaspora, your nationalism is reconnecting with something that's been forcibly like like dissolved or whatever, and it is a tool of like resistance at this point. Maybe not forever. Historically, you know, as things change, maybe this plays out differently, but right now that is actually in a much different situation than something like white nationalism is, which is a tool to reinforce you know, the hegemony, but also in these ways you're saying, it's also like a nothingness. It also has nothing to do with like where individual white, even like ethnicities and stuff come from. It's this big nothing. So I keep saying this, I'm sure I've made this point a million times. It brought me back to thinking about Gaza and about Palestinian flags and stuff like that, and how like it's you know, Battle of Algiers and Fanon and all this stuff, how dialectically in the process of all this, it's good to have these identities for us.
Yeah. And like, so I mean, the cause of Zionism is often very much supported by other alt-right, other ethnic nationalist movements, you know, because it is compatible with National Socialism. It is compatible with alt-right worldviews, because it is an ethno state. Like the way that Israel is currently constructed as an apartheid, being an ethno-nationalist state, it is it's kind of like Magneto would probably has more respect for like a human supremacist as a supremacist, because he's not into the integration of all peoples into like a harmonious like global family.
Yeah.
Like, so those who believe in like a war of my tribe against your tribe, even if they're enemies with that tribe, are like, oh, cool, we're all playing the same game.
Yeah.
Like all of us hate equality and integration. We love borders. So
yeah. Magneto, also Jewish character, I think, right?
Well, reinterpreting it, like, because when we think about X-Men, it came out in Stan Lee. They made it sound like it was about like sort of the civil rights movement. And Magneto and Professor X are often compared to like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King.
Professor X, that makes sense.
But I actually think that really it was, if not intentional, subconsciously, Stan Lee wrestling with two different versions of Judaism as a Jewish man, because Magneto's version, Magneto represents Zionism in a lot of ways. Like, let's have a mutant country. Let's exterminate the humans. They hate us no matter what. Like, he is the eternal victim who's been traumatized by surviving the Holocaust. In the story of the X-Men. And Professor X is the one that's like, as a mind reader, has like empathy for all people and is trying to like create a harmony. And he starts a school, and it's all about education.
Right. Yes, I'm not even a big comic book head, but there's also a lot of great like arguments about the X-Men also being about queer people. But that's funny because I don't understand where Magneto would fit into that. There's someone who's like, we're gonna make a gay country, which would be cool. Someone get on it. Anyways, I'm digressing. Hi everyone. Welcome back to the show. I'm Jake, that's Gabe, and we're gonna be continuing our series on the Magonistas today. Just doing a little bit of flavor up top. It's fleshing some ideas out that I think are relevant to all this. And I have one more, actually, I wanted to step on before we get into this. So something else I was thinking about with regards to all this is like, my little journey, helping me understand where we fit into all this stuff. I've been thinking a lot about generation fights, like not like boomers and Gen X and stuff like that. Particularly when you are like not white or you're from another country historically or whatever. There's this thing where you sort of big dick each other over which generation you are. You hear a lot of jokes of like, because if you're first generation, you're considered very authentic, right? And then like there's this like great 30 Rock joke where Jack Donaghy's like, the first generation comes here and works hard. The second generation goes to school. The third generation takes improv classes and whatever. But Jack Donaghy's a conservative, so he has this conception of immigration, and I always felt kind of weird about this one because I'm technically like very deep generationally because I'm from the part of the world that the border crossed. We didn't cross it, like you said, right? And so I was thinking about like how this kind of stuff doesn't really apply. Like for one thing, if you're from specifically this part of the world, the generation thing doesn't really work in terms of like kind of measuring people or challenging people's authenticity, because like you wouldn't say that to like a Native American, right? You can be like, oh, what generation are you? It's like, what do you mean? Like
That's right.
Here first. But the other thing about it is that I think it's a profoundly unmaterial argument to make, because the implication when you say like this person's, oh, you're third generation, I'm first or whatever, the implication is that you sort of have to believe in the American dream to make this argument that the longer you're here in America, the higher you rise up, right? But like what we know as materialists is that like working class just reproduces itself as the working class. So you can be 10th generation here and still be poor if you were working class, right?
And there's a glass ceiling, I think, within the system, and you can look at it with sort of within the Black experience specifically, how they have after the Civil War Reconstruction, and then so progress isn't linear. After Reconstruction, you have Black senators, Black congressmen. They're in charge of their own communities in a lot of places in the South, and then Reconstruction ends, and all of those rights get stripped away, and then we end up in Jim Crow. So it's not like a linear, like the arc of justice isn't bending in a certain direction ever, permanently, and we're not evolving. Sometimes we take two steps back, and with the immigrant community, and so one example with that is like when Obama came into office. You have like the largest redistribution of home ownership and Black intergenerational wealth disappearing, because those were the people that were most affected by the economic crisis at that time, and they're the ones that lost their homes in the housing crash. So there's that, but then like you also see the first or second generation of people moving to this city from the islands like Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic. And they are able to start businesses, or they have vibrant mutual aid and community networks. But then their children end up going to public schools in the city where the schools are being defunded. And those children are also coming of age under deindustrialization and under criminalization within the city, under stop and frisk or the war on drugs or the war on terror. And so it isn't a linear, it's like, there's also this internalized guilt of like, oh, my parents came here with $50 with the story of $50 in their pocket and like it was sandals, and they were able to start a bodega.
Right.
But then
also $50 is a lot more money back then.
Yeah. And like, but that they hit that brick wall. And you even look at like MS-13, right, which is an American homegrown system of criminalizing people. MS-13 didn't start in El Salvador. Those were the children of refugees that moved here from El Salvador because of the Civil War that we started there by enabling the CIA and death squads from El Salvador to murder Archbishop Romero, ending any sort of peaceful negotiations around a more leftist government. And so those kids, they grow up in LA, and then they reach that dead end, right? The glass ceiling was there. Maybe their parents were able to work and get jobs, but those kids then become the gang that we consider, you know.
And the actual sort of, you know, more like legitimate, less aggressive mutual aid and solidarity networks died when the police crushed the Black Panthers. So that led to, like, you know, this new way of doing things, and like the Crips and the Bloods came about and stuff like that. I just read a bunch of Mike Davis shit about this.
Love Mike Davis sports, baby.
Yeah, and you know what? And I think I'm going to probably do an episode about this. But there's a chapter in City of Courts where he gets into like the Cristeros and like the split between having like kind of like progressive cardinals and shit like that, and Catholicism, which goes back to a lot of shit we talked about last episode. So maybe we'll do that soon.
But they said, I can't stop, man. I can't stop. So they're like, why is the religious community predominantly, especially in Catholicism, which is where I went to Catholic schools, and there was that tradition of liberation theology, and there were a lot of leftist Catholics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but we think today, like, why is Catholicism sort of in this J.D. Vance era? Why is it aligned with like Blackwater, and why is it aligned with terrible crusader foreign policy like ideas? And one way to look at it is like, well, because the U.S. has traditionally clamped down on leftism everywhere, including extinguishing those left religious leaders and elevating the evangelicals that were more aligned with like Reaganomics and prosperity gospel.
Totally. Yeah. Okay, damn. So many ideas. We're gonna have to do a podcast about that. You'll probably come back. There's also, I mean, then also he talks about fucking MS-13, which we were just talking about. But that's neither here nor there. Today we're talking about a different book, a couple books. Reading once again from Kelly Little Hernandez's Bad Mexicans, Mexicanos Malos, as Porfirio Diaz called them, and The Dreams of Freedom, the Magon reader. By Chaz, Bufe, and Mitchell Cohen Verter. They're edited. I don't know. It's a reader, so it's a bunch of shit. It's on AK Press. And these are the texts I've been using to get us through the story of the Magonistas, which let's jump back into. I'm sure there'll be plenty to discuss. When we last left off, Dragon Ball Z, when we last left our heroes, Ricardo Flores Magon was yelling from his barrel chest at an audience of liberals who did not like what he had to say. He was saying what we're all thinking. They were like, can he say that? Can he say that on TV, right? This is TV of the time because they're not TV yet. Is yelling in a theater. And he's finally breaking the taboo on criticizing the Porfiriato. But some stuff's going to happen after that. So, yeah, he turns the crowd around. They're like, holy shit, this guy's crazy. He's birthed as like an iconoclast, a heretic, right? Let's pick up right there. So around this time, Regeneracion becomes more overt, and it takes off like crazy, man. Like only like 28% of Mexicans were even literate at this point. But it took off like crazy because what you would do is you'd carry it around and you would like get up on top of a box and just read it in like the corner of a town or whatever. And, you know, when there's this thing hanging in the air where everyone knows something's up and everyone kind of feels like, you know, you kind of know already that maybe the guy we have in office isn't actually good, but no one's really articulated it yet. This spreads like, you know, wildfire. People are having these like moments where they're feeling like, you know, ecstatic, like it's mind blowing. It's literally the way people feel when they listen to, you know, Bill Hicks for the first time or whatever. They're like, what, the drug war is bad, right? And you're 13 or whatever. They're blowing people's minds, right? He called Diaz a despot on the front page, and they vowed to run for office. That'll come up later. It's kind of a weird thing. They published this woman who had been raped by the Jefes Politicos. They did a lot of that stuff. So they just, you know, just sort of like
early Me Too stuff, man.
Yeah. Me también. You too, mama. Too. Okay. Anyways, they do a lot of just discussing like these Jefes Politicos and how corrupt they are because they have, you know, these guys that have all these powers and they're going around and they're engaging in all this graft and racketeering and stuff and a lot of sexual assault. And they work with these anarcho-feminists like Mendoza, and so a lot of the stuff is, you know, centering around stuff like that, and it's good. It's a good thing, right? Don't come up here. You're gonna step on my thing. Okay. And eventually the Diaz regime raids their office and throws them in Belém prison, which I think I talked a little bit about last time.
Which was their old neighborhood.
Yeah. It's where it's the poor part of town that their mom moved them to because they had no money because Diaz wouldn't like help them out. So it's like ironic, right? Belém prison was built in the 1600s by the church, and later I think Juarez and the liberals turned it into a modern prison with 3 stories, and it's like the 3rd floor, the top one is for like they call it like prisoners of notoriety or something like that. And when they were first arrested for just like protesting and stuff, they got thrown in the top floor, and it's just like, you know, jail, and it's like, hey, what's the big deal, right? But now that they're really pissing off Porfirio Diaz, they get thrown in the bottom, which is like a dungeon, and the descriptions of it are just visceral and disgusting. Like it's all just, you know, every human liquid you can imagine.
Yeah, dude, it runs downhill.
Yeah. It's dark and dank, and like, you know, Magone said he would reach out and touch the wall and it's just covered in like blood and spit and stuff like that.
It reminds me of like in Saw when Carrie Hughes wakes up chained to the in the bathroom, and there's just like a dead body in the middle of the room and just like a toilet full of feces. It reminds me of Saw. Like the description, the dungeon basement.
And there's a little clown that says "Quieres jugar" or something. Have you ever watch horror movies in Spanish? They're so funny. If you've never had the pleasure of doing this, watch Chucky in Spanish. It's so fucking funny because he's got like, I mean, the joke in the English version is he's got like an adult, you know, biker's voice or whatever.
Yeah.
But little red-haired guy that's just like, hey, like it's so fucking good. Yeah.
That guy, yeah. I've seen a couple clips online, and it is hilarious, and also a great way to learn a second language, friends.
True. Yeah. Damn, that's a good idea. Brad Dourif is the one in the English version, by the way, if you didn't know that, who's a really famous, great character actor. He was on Deadwood and X-Files and stuff like that. Anyways, back to Belém, right? So Belém's horrible. It's a horrible horror prison, and it's literally horrible. It's the solitary cells are referred to as hell and purgatory just by you know, colloquial nature.
I don't really feel like this place is about rehabilitation.
Yeah, no, it's, imagine that, right? I guess if you go into like hell, you don't really get out of hell, like as a concept. So that makes sense. The only people that get out of hell are like demons. So Is that rehabilitation? Huh? Think about
Yeah.
it. Chucky? Is he a real rehabilitated demon? Who knows? In the dungeon, Magon saw like the surplus labor population. Basically, we talked about his motorcycle diaries, Che journey last time.
Mhm.
This is all continuous. He notices that the dungeon, the floor that he wasn't on last time, is full of beggars and thieves, bums. People refer to as leprosos, right? Lepers.
Yeah.
Um,
The marginalized.
and so while they're in there, his brother Enrique would visit and he would write them letters, and the letters would start off with "Queritos gordos," which means "dear fatsos," which is very funny. So Enrique's a funny guy, right? They said at one point he got a bike and he got a vanity plate on the bike that just said Porfirio Diaz. And when somebody asked him about it, he said, "I could ride him into the ground." Weird old timey jokes like that. So Enrique starts editing Regeneracion while they're in jail, and he comes into the mix that way, right? So then this thing happens. It's a cool story. Diaz, he goes and he visits the Magon brothers' dying mother because he's starting to realize that they're kind of a powerful force, and he's a clever politician, right? So he crushes his enemies and his dissenters, sure, but he also notices people like this that are smart. Maybe if he makes the right moves here, he does the art of the deal on them, he can just get them to like assimilate into his system and work for him, because he realizes they're like these powerful like writers, like they have all this like power with like public sway and stuff like that. They don't want to do it though, but he goes to their mother and he tells them, if they just repent, and I'll let them out of jail, and you should tell them that or whatever. And the mother says, "Tell President Diaz that I choose to die without seeing my sons," because she's dying, right? So he's like, they won't be able to see you unless you tell them to do this, right? So she says, "Tell President Diaz that I choose to die without seeing my sons, and tell him this: I'd rather see my sons hang from a tree or a hanging post than for them to retract or repent." Holy shit, so hardcore, right? It's the coolest thing ever. Their dying mom said it right before she passes away forever. So it's a really cool story. The problem is no one really knows if it's true. The thing is, Enrique, the youngest brother, after way later, after all this whole story ends and Magon dies and everything, Enrique's still alive, and the Mexican Rev has happened. And at this point, everyone is talking about Villa and Madero and Zapata, and they kind of forgot about the precursor, Magon, right? So Enrique made it like his life's work late in life to just like preserve the memory of his brother and preserve the legend. And they say he embellished a lot of shit because these are like cowboy stories, I mean, they're cool. Like the ones that a lot of the shit that's real, that's recorded, are people saying stuff like this right before they die, but they don't actually know. Some people think that he was he's painting a picture here or whatever.
He was selling the sizzle a little bit, But
Yeah.
I gotta say, I love Narcos, by the way, Narcos Mexico, and obviously,
yeah.
but what I find interesting is like one reason that I like it is that representation, right? I like seeing Mexico, I like hearing the Spanish, I like seeing all the actors. But this story, the Magon story, would be a fantastic Netflix series that will never get made because the United States is 100% the villain in it,
Yeah.
Whereas with Narcos Mexico, you always have this sort of sort of objective white cop narrator who can describe what's happening and like always framing the Mexicans as like the villains no matter what. And in this one, it would be like the Magon story on Netflix would be very much just amazing anarchist Mexican journalists speaking the truth and writing the truth in opposition to the United States trying to crush freedom.
Yeah. The entire time I'm reading this story, I'm thinking, man, this would make such a good show. But like, yeah, there's reasons it probably wouldn't happen. I don't know. I could maybe see it happening. Sometimes stuff like that squeaks by. Like, I love Deadwood. It's one of my favorite shows ever. This all
Yeah.
feels a little Deadwoody to me. And just the dramatic nature of it, the way people are talking, I think it would. I don't know. You know what? If you're listening, let's make the show, Hollywood. But I think you're right. I think you can't. Maybe we'll just make it another country. I don't know. Anyways, so outside Belém, right? The squad continues working. We've got this whole group going now, right? Antonio Diaz Soto y Gama gives a speech that says Diaz, this is like some of this great dialogue I'm talking about. I'm pitching here, right? He says Diaz holds the horseman's spit in higher regard than the hallowed Constitution of 57. The spit which today lacerates his horse and tomorrow disembowels the people, right? He yells this into some crowd. That's like so cool. And he's immediately thrown in Belém for it, right? So this is starting to happen. People are like, I'm going to say stuff out loud, just like Ricardo. And then they're thrown into prison, just like Ricardo. Enrique publishes the speech in Regeneración, and what's her face? Juana Belém Mendoza. She's publishing Vesper, her anarcho-feminist journal. She has like 8,000 subscribers. It's a bunch of feminist writers. I think what's really funny about reading all this, it's how much like getting subscribers is part of this story. With regards to like media back then and how central like propaganda is to the story is like, I'm like, I remember when we got to 8,000 subscribers. And like, it's weird though, because 8,000 subscribers at this point for something like a paper when the like postal service has just been established is a much bigger deal than getting 8,000 now. The scale has increased a lot. And something I think about a lot when I'm reading this stuff is one of my old roommates, I think it was one of the Antifada guys, either Sean or Andy, kind of pointed this thing out at one point about this concept and about how there's this guy named Vosh. I try to stay out of the streamer world, but he's a streamer. Sometimes people say he's good. Sometimes it's like he accidentally showed horse porn on his stream. Oh, fuck, he's taking his stream down. I don't know what the fuck's going on with these people. I don't know. I know people that in our Discord say they like him. Some people don't. I, again, don't know about any of this shit. But one of my old roommates mentioned at one point, pointed out, objective fact, which is apparently this Vouch character is technically the most read anarchist in human history, because streamers do these like streams, they get like millions of views and stuff. And when you read history back here, where like, you know, the original anarchists are kind of popping off. Yeah, they're getting like 20, 30,000 or whatever.
But, you know, you have to think about how the literacy levels were so much lower. And it's also the impact that it makes to have your writings in front of the right people, right? Either policymakers or people with means to enact your vision. So like I think about, you know, in the American Revolution up here, they always talk about like John Locke or was that his name? Yeah, I think so. And then or Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine, yeah.
Thomas Paine.
John Locke is also a philosopher, but he's also a character on Lost, and I always screw that up in my head. The characters on Lost is named after the real John Locke, but you're thinking of Common Sense by Thomas Paine.
Yeah, and how like just it wasn't that everybody in the colonies was reading this stuff. All it took was like the, you know, couple merchants in New England and a couple plantation owners down south to read this stuff to mobilize the forces for War of Independence.
Yeah, because it was media, you know, and it's a spark. And also like something I think that doesn't really come up much in this book I'm reading here, but something I noticed is that there's probably something to be gleaned from the fact that like so many people in the junta here, in the rebel writers, are like lawyers and people from like the aristocracy, essentially, because there's that caste system we talked about in Mexico, and these are people of certain level of means who've been able to like educate themselves and then speak to other people who have been able to educate themselves, but trickle it all down actually, because they're actually they have some consciousness and realize the big picture, and they don't buy into like white supremacy and capitalism that tries to convince you that all the incentives are backwards and that you need to just support this system that it'll bring all the people up by itself or whatever.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like they were trying to climb the ladder, especially when you bring up that Porfirio Diaz went to their mother and tried to co-opt them, and it was the Magone being in that basement of the Belen prison where he's rubbing shoulders with so many more common people, and he's able to empathize with their plights and see how they're being broken by the system. And another thing that really fascinates me about this story is how many anarchist feminists were in play, and how many women who are not necessarily the main characters in this story, but who were so pivotal to informing the worldviews and politics of the Magone brothers and their writing.
Yeah, and we'll get to that a little bit later here in the notes, but I think there's something to be said for anarchism there, especially of the era here, of arguably not wanting to just reproduce and like reestablish certain hierarchies that are outcomes of private property, like the patriarchy, whereas you could maybe critique some forms of socialism and communism for not taking that stuff into account and sort of just reestablishing power dynamics between men and women and stuff like that. But we'll get to that because that gets a little complicated with Magone and Magone. But like you said, like his resistance to being assimilated is the defining thing about him. Is he has a just like an unshakable integrity, and people more often than not people describe it as like stubbornness, like he's an asshole, but that's what makes him the center of all this. So Camilo Arriaga, the nephew of the person who wrote the Constitution, the liberal side of this, he planned the 1902 Liberal Conference. He was approached, so he's having another one of those conferences. They're gonna do like this is a thing in like leftist history, right? There's these like internationals and stuff like this. In this story, it's these liberal conferences. And so the second one in 1902, he's putting it together, and he's approached by two congressmen, and he thinks that he's probably turned to these two congressmen because he knows them, and he's like, okay, they're starting to become sympathetic to the cause, right? So he allows them in, and he starts organizing and planning with them. And later, when they're having a planning meeting where like a bunch of people showed up to it, a bunch of people in the crowd and in the audience, they have been wearing like these big sombreros and shit and ponchos, and they throw them off, and they're cops, and they yell "Viva General Diaz," right? And everyone gets arrested, and Arriaga and Rivera and Sarabia, they end up getting arrested, and they end up at Belen prison. So everyone keeps ending up in the fucking prison dungeon, right? And that should be a lesson to someone like Arriaga, right? Is like they're not just gonna join you, right? They're not just gonna be like, oh, he's got a good point, and join you. You're gonna have to deal with this system trying to like protect itself, right? So in the prison, they communicate through the walls. They develop these weird like codes and stuff, jail stuff. And eventually they get out. And at this point, Jesus, the oldest Magone brother, he decides he's done with dissident journalism. But Ricardo, at this point, he doesn't go with him. He only becomes more powerful, And this is kind of the last we hear of Jesus for a long time. So he gets off the train here, and this happens a lot in the stories. People go, oh, okay, that's enough. I get off. Magone never gets off. Their printing press is been confiscated. Arriaga arranges for Ricardo to take over El Hijo de Ahuizote because the Regeneracion printing press has been confiscated. So I talked about this on the show episodes back when I went to Mexico. I'm gonna repeat myself a little bit, but El Hijo de Ahuizote is like another paper. It's also run out of the Zocalo. It's the one that I went and found because Regeneracion was run out of here for a long time, so it's a historical place. And it's also where like now supposedly I found out this isn't true, but up until I guess a few years ago, because they talk about it in this book, a lot of the like preserved Magon writings that Diaz owned are kept there as like a museum. I went to it and it was a flash mob, and it was like it was a community center, which is very funny because that is anarchism. Teaching people how to just skills for free, skill swap. That's an anarchist principle. So it was true to its nature, but I didn't get to see the museum. But anyways, El Hijo de Ahuizote is really funny because it's like the Ahuizote is a mythical dog creature. It's like a mer-dog, like a mermaid dog.
Sure.
And they did
like
satire.
A sea wolf. Sea chihuahua.
Yeah, like a sea wolf. Like an overpriced restaurant in Bushwick. Hey, who lives in New York? So, but it's like a satirical newspaper. I think that's why it's called Son of a Dog. Like son of a bitch is like the joke, right? But it's like about mythology and stuff.
Like a National Lampoon.
Yeah, or like an Onion or something. So lots of like, turn of the century, like wood carved satirical drawings of politicians and stuff like that. The guy who owns it, the editor, is like sick. So Arriaga's like, hey, let Ricardo run it. He's right up your alley, right? So they operate out of El Hijo de Ahuizote for a little while. This ends 6 months later when the Diaz regime breaks it up and arrests the Magon brothers. Again, they just keep getting arrested for criticizing the government. In 1903, the rebel writers are released. And in Mexico City, Juan Sarabia's cousin Manuel joins. They call him El Chamaco, the kid. This kid, Santiago de la Hoz, he's only 15 years old. He's a 15-year-old poet, and he's a juvenile. He's like they call him a juvenil luchador, the young fighter. The young fighter, right? He's this little kid, so 15-year-old poet kid. You're like, he's a fighter. He's gonna make it. Oh, I believe in him. His characters are so ridiculous. So Hijo de Ahuizote gets new equipment. He goes back to work. Magon starts writing like crazy. All the reports, the spies and stuff who would spy on him said he just hunches over a typewriter and he's just a madman.
It's pre-Adderall. What's this guy doing? What's in the drinking water for this guy?
For him, I think it's just pure like anger. Like he's pissed off and it's like resentful. He seems like one of those people who's just like, he won't let it go, like the inciting incident that just made him an anarchist. It's like it's forged in fire in him. He's such a good character. He's such a bastard. He'll never fucking stop. Hijo gets new equipment. He goes back to work. February 5th, 1903. So the third anniversary of the 1901 Liberal Conference. Is that right? Second? I don't know. The crew meets at the Hijo de Ahuizote office because there's this Constitution Day firework thing and parade happening. And let's see, the 5th of November, that's Constitution Day, right? So they do this thing in the Zocalo, in the center of town, right, where all the government stuff is, where the cathedral is. That's where the Hijo offices are. They go into the balcony and they unfurl this massive banner that says La Constitución ha muerto. The Constitution is dead. And there's like a picture of it. It's cool. They take this big photo op. They all look cool. They look like old-timey anarchists. They're standing in front of this big banner, and they're doing this thing that's like illegal. It's times a flat circle. You see it right now, Free Palestine, right, everywhere. This is published with a caption by Juan Sarabia. He wrote, "We solemnly censure the assassins of the Constitution, who, as if blood-stained mockery of the people they have scoffed, celebrate this day with demonstration and merriment and pleasure," or demonstration of merriment and pleasure. They published a bunch of manifestos attacking the capitalists, the priests, and the high official. And this becomes a thing that's not really set outright, but central to the anarchist principles at play here that Magon is starting to put together. He calls it the Dark Trinity, right? A lot of these people are socialists, they want to reform the system. A lot of them are liberals. They just want to run for office and just have a better president, right?
Look, if we just had a more efficient system where the government what representatives in all of the different regions weren't involved in sexual violence and were not involved in graft and corruption. If we just had, a merit-based system where it was just responsible citizens running these institutions, things would be fine. We can change the system from the inside. The rules that have been established are all fair. It's more that those who are taking those roles are corrupt and cheating.
If I didn't know better, I think you're being a little facetious.
Jake, we can change the system from the inside. We should both start working in prisons and work our way up from being the benevolent guard to being the warden.
Let's go to prison. Let's go to the police academy. That'll be fun.
If we joined Border Patrol, bro, we would be the most fair Border Patrol agents. I would listen. We would listen. There'd be water. People would be hydrated on their journey through the desert and taken to air-conditioned cells before being expelled again.
Let's write a madcap comedy about you and I becoming ICE agents. And they were like super trooper ICE agents,
Yeah. Oh, man. That's a form of propaganda that doesn't exist yet, like a Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but it's like Del Rio ICE.
Yeah. There was stuff like that way back in the day, that barely scratched the surface, like the Keystone Cops I read about, this old TV show, that would get it would get pressure from the government for making the institution of police look bad or whatever.
Well, there's a really good sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
There's a Jack Nicholson movie I like from the 70s called I think it's called The Border, and he's like a rookie Border Patrol guy, and he's trying to do the right thing. So it is still propaganda, but it is about sort of the graft and corruption and brutality imposed on just poor climate refugees. Some of the people who are trying to cross the border are the survivors of an earthquake that happened in a village in Mexico. And so it's we're following their journey, and then we're seeing Jack on the border sort of also trying to wrap his head around the culture of being a fish out of water around these Border Patrol dudes that suck, and then finding the humanity in the people who are wading across the Rio for a better life.
Man, okay, I want to stop and talk about a couple of things here. So one, propaganda, it's kind of interesting. You're right. There hasn't been an ICE funny cop show yet. And part of that, I think people like propaganda. Part of what it does when you make something like that is that it makes something like an ICE agent seem friendly and destigmatized or whatever. That's bad. But also, you're making something about an institution like that at all in any light, whether it's a drama or a comedy or whatever, just lends legitimacy to the institution. So that's a thing that is yet to break open yet, is that we get either Brooklyn Nine-Nine or Super Troopers or The Pit, and it's about a bunch of, that's probably going to happen at some point because that's more often than not what propaganda is. But I don't know. You just got me thinking about that. But I want to go back to anarchism for a little bit here because, you're talking you're joking, you're being facetious and playing the part of the liberal here who argues this system can be reformed. It's just particularly bad people within it that are the problem. And this conflict between the left and the center never goes away. I am having it all day, every day when I talk to people in this country. People know generally something's wrong, and fucking a bunch of this country sure is just MAGA freaks or whatever. But liberals, a lot of people that think they're kind of on the same side as us, and don't really see the distinction here. A lot of them make the argument that Trump is particularly evil and that these politicians and all of his goons are particularly bad people. And it's not the system, it's the fact that it was captured by people who are just bad people. And I've been thinking a lot about this David Graeber thing that I saw recently where he's talking, who is a famous anarchist. I don't know. I think he doesn't call himself, or he didn't call himself that, but he is. But he made a really good point, or he illustrated this concept really well. by talking about something that happened during the Iraq War, which is that the CEOs of a bunch of energy companies came and wrote a letter, or they wrote a letter to Bush, like George W. Bush, the president at the time.
Yeah.
And the letter, basically what it said was, you need to regulate us, like these companies, these industries. Like they are starting to notice all these horrible outcomes of having this unregulated energy industry, and the results involving, you know, economic devastation, war, death, the environment, all this stuff. The CEOs of these companies wrote a letter asking to be regulated. And what Graeber, you know, says when he talks about this is like, this illustrates perfectly that capitalism as a system has incentives that you cannot change. So this argument that if you put a good person at the head of a company and we just need to have better CEOs, which is an argument that the Democratic Party makes all the time, like we're just going to work with the better CEOs. It does not matter if you put the most moral, altruistic person possible in a position within a system like capitalism, or arguably what I'm going to argue probably is also liberalism, is that the incentives inherently outweigh the individual person's ability to do anything, because the incentives are you have to provide for your shareholders. Also, just the way competition works in the market is that, you know, say you are the head of an oil company and you decide, okay, there's a number we're not going to go past. Like growth past this number is immoral because it has all these bad things. If you stop there, you're in competition with other companies. Someone else is just going to eat up that part of the graph, and they're going to not stop there. And you can't get everyone to just agree. You get every oil company in the world to agree to stop at that number. Someone's going to start a new oil company, right? That's how capitalism incentivizes growth, and it needs
That's how
growth.
in the wire that's like they have the co-op, right? All the drug dealers have a co-op, and then Marlowe shows up and he's like, fuck this co-op, right?
Yeah.
Like he is the most naked, avaricious, and extremely reductive version of capitalism. And the logical conclusion of all of the competition is that there can be only one. Like capitalism always leads to a hierarchy of like, it's like Highlander, where like you there's no peers that you even want to exist. You want to gobble up all of your competition, and it is a race to the bottom, right? Because anybody who has any morality or any scruples is going to lose out to the person that has no scruples. And we're looking at this with like United Healthcare in the news now, like Luigi Merck, that guy, and then the next CEO that's there, he is castigated by the shareholders because United Healthcare was trying to like mitigate some of their worst practices for PR. But ultimately, the shareholder value is all that matters. So they are at the whim of the CEO, is at the whim of the sort of the masses of people who just want to see that number rise, like their profits rise.
I forgot that in the wire they make a co-op. That's anarchism. That's kind of fun, right? If you shop at the wire drug co-op for like heroin, you should get a tote bag, you know, that says you're part of the community. That'd be cool. So yeah, but like, so the dark trinity that Magon starts to write about eventually, we'll get there eventually. It's kind of just on his mind right now, but you know, he starts to identify the three pillars of power here. The where is it? The priest, the capitalist, and the high official, right? So capitalism, the state, and the church, because the church has such a still, like we talked about last episode, it's different from what happened with Protestantism in the United States. The church in these like post-colonial societies is still part of the government, right? So there's all of this, you know, discourse about like how that's supposed to play out. What are we supposed to do with that?
The largest real estate holders, and also having sway over so much of the lumpen proletariat, or the working class, or the peasants, right? Having so much influence and control over them, especially through like the encomienda system that existed. And to this note, like, you know how all these plantations burned down, or a plantation burned down in the US, and everyone was like happy about that. And Americans go and they have weddings on plantations. So basically they've romanticized these like concentration camps, labor camps for enslaved Black people. And they've been turned into this Disney sort of place to go visit and celebrate your weddings. In
Mhm.
California, there's like a series of missions, and all these like cute little towns are named after that, like Mission Viejo, fucking Capistrano, all these places. And those are seen as places people go visit to relax, to hang out, to like look at the nostalgia of the old Spanish California. But the reality of those missions is they were the plantations, right? They were the concentration camps where natives from all over California were forced to go and till and work the land for the priests and the monks who turned those places into businesses. And all the natives were exploited there, abused, murdered, and their cultures were obliterated. So those missions should be burned down in the same way. Like for those places to be seen as romantic getaway spots is like
Mhm.
some Auschwitz, like a ball pit for the kids and a playground at Auschwitz. Like
Abort mission. That's what I say. Mission not accomplished. So yeah, and I mean, like, even like, in capitalism, with the church still being around, even up here, I mean, and I'm like David's book I was reading about, like the Catholic Church is still like the largest employer of a lot of demographics and stuff like that. It just converts to still owning everything through the system of private property. Okay, so April 2nd, 1903, a march is held to commemorate the Battle of Puebla. It turns into an anti-re-election protest, and Porfirio Diaz, he's on the balcony. He thinks like, oh, my people, they love me. And then he's like horrified when it turns into no re-election. He's like, well, what the fuck is happening? And he runs back in his balcony, right? So like Battle of Algiers, like the consciousness starts to spread, and that becomes a major factor in all this, is that the people are just sort of starting to feel emboldened to say, hey, no re-election, it's just stuff like that isn't even that stark, isn't even that threatening to him. The governor of Nuevo Leon wins re-election. An anti-re-election march about him grows deadly when he orders troops to open fire on students. Time's a flat circle. So Arriaga and Soto Gama submit a legal accusation against him, but he's reelected anyway. So they have to flee to the U.S. because they're like, oh, okay, the government's like serious. This is turning into authoritarianism and something dark, right? Arriaga and Magone start to get into arguments about the topic of running for office because Arriaga is a liberal. So his point of view in all this is like, we hate Diaz, right? Diaz is the problem. We should run for office. We should form a party and run for office. And he's like arguing with Magone's increasingly becoming an anarchist. And he's saying, Magone, you're the guy. We should run you, dude. You're charismatic and everyone loves you. And Magone has the iron core here to reject that compliment, really, and go like, no, that's somehow the point of this is not to make me the president of Mexico. The point of this is for there to be no president of Mexico. So on April 11th, Hijo de Ahuizote blasts Diaz for making Mexicans the servants of foreigners who exploit the wealth of our country. 5 days later, the office is raided, equipment is destroyed, and Sarabia and Magone are arrested again. In late 1903, they get out. Hijo and Vesper are both shut down. Judges issue injunction banning them from writing, like them specifically, and it starts to become very apparent that they cannot live in Mexico. So everyone begins to trickle north to escape Diaz. The last of the group is Ricardo, Enrique, and Juan Sarabia. Ricardo returns to the destroyed office of El Hijo de Ahuizote to pick his still functioning typewriter out of the wreckage, only so that he can sell it to buy a train ticket out of Mexico City. He goes across the entire country and he flees to Texas. And it's the first of many times that he has to get the hell out of Dodge, man. Crazy, right? So let's talk a little bit about immigration and how it functions at this point, right? Because fucked up thing about this story is that a lot of the laws about Mexicans immigrating kind of come from a lot of this conflict, or at least around tendrils of it. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act had passed, and immigration services existed, but it didn't even really inspect like Mexican and Canadian border crossers until around 1907, because 1882 thing is just specific to politics with Chinese immigrants in the United States being really racist in that specific way against Chinese workers, right, in the railroads and stuff like that. I'm sorry, this is really funny. This is part of the book that I read about this. Apparently there was this thing where a lot of the Chinese workers who still were trying to get across the border to go work and make money would just pretend to be Mexican.
Yeah, and we see that in Born in East LA, which we brought up before. But in that movie, Cheech Marin's character is in Mexico, and he's trying to make enough money to get a coyote to bring him over the border. And one of the jobs he takes is to teach Chinese immigrants who are waiting in Tijuana how to be Chicano, so they can. When they get over the border, it's so funny because he's like just teaching them like all sorts of like, hey, what's happening? You know, like, and he's got them all wearing like blue bandanas with sunglasses, doing like a cholo strut. It's phenomenal. Yeah,
I mean, that's literally, they said like, I mean, they would fucking put on ponchos and sombreros and shit and just be like, and it's like, you know, to a racist white American border agent, they might just be like, yeah, okay. Like you look, it's, yeah, I can't tell, you know, and like, it's so fucking crazy that happened. But anyways, up to 1904, the Flores Magón brothers and Montserrat cross the border and they land in Laredo, and you know, they don't really have problems crossing, right? They meet up with Arriaga, Juana Mendoza, Manuel Sarabia, Villarreal Marquez brothers from Del Rio, who they publish there's a million of these. I'm just gonna like kind of run past them when I get to them in my notes, but like everyone has a newspaper, right? All of these people, this is a network of rebel writers that are all working with each other. And they all notice that they pop off, and so that like every time they meet with someone like this, who's like, I've got a safe house for you in this new town, it's someone who owns a newspaper, who publishes a newspaper, who publishes Regeneracion articles in the newspaper. So they're like one big network.
It's just called a whole bunch of podcasters on on one network together.
It's like, I mean, God, I wish being a podcaster wasn't so stupid and meaningless in a lot of ways, because like this is a story from an era in history where like this is a propagandist war. Like they changed history by doing this stuff, and I'm sure on some level what we're doing is as well, but like it's not the same. Like this is like the president is literally going after you because your newspaper is too cool. So Sara Estela Ramirez, who read Regeneracion, she read it in 1901 when she was like 20 years old or something like that. She started a liberal club in Laredo. She's 23, I think, when she meets them. She's like a young kid, and she established a feminist newspaper called La Corregidora to publish Regeneracion and her poetry and stuff like that. So she becomes, you know, a trusted confidant here. Now this gets us to the era known by historians in the United States around this time as Juan Crow, right? It's kind of a retroactive term, but it's pretty apt because this is an untold story. You know, this is like a really kind of lost part of American and Mexican history. And the story, the name Juan Crow is pretty apt because a lot of the same shit from Jim Crow happened to Mexicans around this time, right after the United States took this part of Mexico and just dealt with the fact that they had taken over this place and that there are now these undesirable people in it that they, you know, just want to make not part of the equation. They want to force you to immigrate. They want to immigrate to back to Mexico. They want to kill you. They want to do all these things, right? So 1900 to 1910, about 100,000 Mexican laborers crossed the border and made up about 70 to 90% of the railroad track crew. They were lured in with food and housing, but the deals were, you know, that like you'll get this housing, but it comes out of your paycheck. So there's a lot of indentured servitude and company towns and stuff like that happening. And for whatever reason, I'm not even really well read on why the United States hated using Chinese workers so much, but was totally fine with using Mexicans. There's all these different ethnic minorities and stuff that are allowed to work on the railroads. There's like stuff where like everyone gets paid on a different scale depending on race, and Mexicans are paid less than white ethnics like Greeks, for example, through just race science justifications. The argument that they're fine with it, they're fine with like a low quality of living, you know, because like look at them, they live in garbage or whatever, even though it's like you created whatever. So post 1848, which is the end of the Mexican-American War, the U.S. came up with shrewd ways to clear the newly stolen land of Mexicans and indigenous. Egregiously high land taxes in Texas, where Mexicans own a lot of the land. That was the thing. And then eventually lynch mobs, and also the Texas Rangers to enforce all of this. That's where the Texas Rangers came from. I say it all the time. If you were Mexican around this time, you referred to the Texas Rangers as the Rinches, not what I thought I heard when I listened to the audiobook, which was the Grinches. That would be different. It's not the Grinch, it's the Rinches.
And I heard about, so things around this are, there's a tension between like the nativists, white supremacists who look to settle and colonize the land and have it be entirely white and a Protestant Christian versus Mexican Catholicism. So you've got this nativist group that wants to exclusively get rid of brown people, right? And then you have the owners of the businesses in places like Texas, like the ranchers or the people growing things, right? Because they want the cheap labor. So even though both sides, one side's like, no, we need to oppress these people and pay them less and create all these racial hierarchies to like have a cheap workforce, versus nativists who are like, we just want to get rid of all of them. But they're aligned. And you see that today with like, you know, sort of like a Bannon split with the with like who's the other guy? A Musk, right? Bannon, the nationalist, who's like, we just want a strong white America that's all about Western values. And then you've got a Musk who's like, but I still want all of my Indian workers with the H-1B visas. Right. So, but they're aligned in their right-wing ideology. But one's like, let's exploit them. And the other one's like, let's get rid of all of them.
Right. It's almost like capitalism creates contradictions within itself.
And
right.
A lot of the Texas Rangers and the early Border Patrol that was brought to police this area were the children of the white working class, who were like 1 or 2 generations removed from working side by side with the Mexicans. And they, but they weren't part of the business elite. So they were like true believers in sort of white pride, or like a division, right? They weren't aligned with the economic interests of the landowners who wanted to exploit the cheap labor.
Well, I mean, just like today, just like with these discussions people have around like, why do white poor working class people support Trump and MAGA and the police and the government and all this stuff, is they don't understand that the ruling class's interests aren't their interests. They think the ruling class's interests are their interests because capitalism tells you a story, which is that you are not poor, you are a temporarily embarrassed billionaire. Right?
And like, we talked about this with Luisa a lot, and it's about circular migration. So, you know, I look at my family's history, and they would live in Ciudad Acuña, which is right across the border from Del Rio. And they were, some of them, but like even my grandma, who doesn't speak any English, she was an American citizen because she was born on this side of the border. But she lived her whole life, most of her life in like Ciudad Acuña as a child. And my dad did too. And with circular migration, we even see like no Mexicans want to like live in Chicago, like full time. Like it's like back in the day, it's like, why would I want to leave a place where I like my food? I can speak with my friends. Migration was about accumulating enough wealth to go back to wherever you want to live. And it was like, even in the 90s, the closing of the borders, the policing of the borders, and that is a xenophobic impulse. We need to close the borders. But what that did was it locked the gates with more immigrants deciding to stay here. So like if you're from Puebla and you move to the US, and it's incredibly difficult to go back without having all of the checkpoints and perhaps being forced to stay in Mexico, you're like, well, I guess I'll just set up roots here. So like it actually made the United States more Latino.
Yeah.
But when you close the border, it makes the country less, it colors the country more, you know, because people can't leave. Nobody wants to live in fucking Minnesota.
Yeah, right. Especially not people who are used to living in Mexico where it's hot.
Yeah.
Lock the gates, Mark Maron. So yeah, that's definitely part of this, because so much the like a weird way to resolve this conflict between wanting wanting Mexicans to be like these lower class subjugated workers, and then also not wanting them to live here, results in migration. The kind of thing that's still holds somewhat today, where you just go work here and then you go back home once you've made the money or whatever, but that then also conflicts with the border closing that you're talking about. So let's see. On June 12th, 1901, something really important happened. A lot of the Juan Crow stuff culminated in Murray, sit in my damn lap. Doing Juan Crow on you, Murray. The case of Gregorio Cortez, who was a man that was falsely accused of horse theft by a white sheriff. And the way it went down, it's a very sad story. It's because of the white sheriff's broken Spanish, because he couldn't be bothered to learn Spanish while policing people that speak Spanish. So he hears this guy stole a horse. He goes to his house. The guy is just saying banal things like, hello, can I help you? He interprets these things as no white man can arrest me. This is all in like a report he makes later. And he sees this as probable cause. So he pulls out his pistol and he goes to shoot Gregorio Cortez, but Gregorio Cortez also has a pistol and he's a quick shot. So he dodges him and he shoots. And it turns into a situation where he's shot a sheriff and his friend, helps him tackle the guy or whatever. And he runs. And there have been a lot of lynchings up to this point. Like, this is a thing. It's kind of a forgotten part of American history. It's the same fucking white people. What do you think happened, right? It's the same white people, same fucking problem in their eyes. There were a lot of Mexicans around this time just straight up lynched for crimes they didn't commit, just because we didn't like them. The Texas Rangers lynched people for criticizing the Texas Rangers, and it's like, that's a weird, if you think about it, kind of a circular thing, because it's like, well, yeah, it's pretty criticizable, don't you think? But this guy, he's realizes he's about to become one of these cases, so he runs. But he's been a migrant laborer for a long time, so he knows the land really well, and he manages to go on this Homeric odyssey across South Texas with like no shoes on and stuff, and he's ripping off his clothes and making impromptu socks and stuff, and he dodges all these police, and he eventually gets to some friend's house in another town, and he's on the road for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that, and eventually someone turns him in, and he goes, okay, I'm gonna die. But the community raises money for a good lawyer, and he manages to beat the case because he proves that he was in the right, or he wasn't in the wrong, that he shot the guy in self-defense and all this stuff. He's killed like 2 or 3 people at this point, but just from being chased. And anyways, the reason this story is important is because people are talking about it, because there's these newspapers and stuff like that, and the good old tradition of word of mouth, and he becomes the first big corrido, which is the thing I've talked about before, but let's talk about it again. That's these folk songs that people would sing about like heroes from this era. This is a great story about a guy who evades the police.
He's like Bonnie and Clyde, but a better version. He's like Billy the Kid. He's like a Luigi today, in some ways.
There are Luigi corridos.
Yeah, he's a hapless victim of the injustices, and he's somebody who was on the run, and like a fugitive that we could all get behind.
Yeah, he's a folk hero, right? It's cool. So the tradition of singing songs like that, it's been a thing for a while, but this is like the one that kind of makes it into a huge thing. It's considered like the first big one or whatever. Later on, narco corridos happen. We talked about that in another episode, but this is like, I mean, of the time, it's like a person everyone is talking about, like a George Floyd or something like that. He is in jail. I think he's still got like, multiple court cases and stuff like that. When the rebel riders get to Laredo, right? So February 5th, 1904, the junta, they get to Laredo, and they're going to hold the fourth liberal conference, and everyone speaks. I guess they do hold it. The Magone brothers sit under an altar of Benito Juarez, and Juan Sarabia reads a poem to close things out, along with the young fighter Lajos. The Mexican government consul, a guy named Antonio Lomole, reports all this back to Diaz. So everywhere they go, there's a consul, and they all report back to Diaz.
The place is lousy with snitches.
Yeah. He has these consuls in these towns in the US, right? Because there's all these holdovers. I mean, that was still a thing like when Juarez was president. A lot of them are holdovers from him. He has this Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Ignacio Mariscal. He's a holdover from the Juarez presidency. He helped secure U.S. recognition of Mexico after the Napoleon invasion and after the Civil War ended, after they were kind of like, just reestablishing things. And he starts doing things like begging the U.S. Secretary of State to just intervene and kill the Diaz or the Magone brothers, or just like arrest them or whatever. But at this point, the United States isn't interested really yet. So they're meanwhile relaunching Regeneracion in Laredo. They're living on like wild plants and herbs. But people are coming from all around to meet them because Ricardo especially is like really famous. Regeneracion is starting to get really famous. And there's the schism in the group though between Arriaga and Magone, and it's starting to get more and more stark because they're starting to actually talk about what the plan is, and Arriaga is not really down with what Magone is starting to formulate. He wants to work within the system. So Arriaga splits and he moves to San Antonio with Juana Mendoza, with Sara Ramirez, and a few others. And this happens all over the story. There's these splits. People go to different towns. So they go to San Antonio. The young fighter, De La Hoz, he drowns in the Rio Grande. And the thing is, they've been like noticing that they've been being followed a lot at this point. Like there's people hiding behind trees and watching them. So they're being spied on and they know it. So when the young fighter drowns in the Rio Grande, they start to wonder if he really drowned, right?
Yep,
or if
that's right.
So they ditch Laredo and they start to just storm around the Brown Belt, the Valley. Cortez, around this time, finally gets pinned. He finally gets life in prison.
Whoa, let's stop there for one moment.
Please. Go ahead.
Pee break.
Oh. All right, gotcha. Okay, so we're back. The Gregorio Cortez, the Corrido guy, he finally gets life in prison and end of an era, right? So, Arriaga at this point, though, this is what's interesting about having the liberal anarchist split in the junta, is that Arriaga reaches out to this guy named Francisco Madero, and he hits him up for money, and he gets it. He gets a donation of $2,000, which is $50,000 in today's money. So let's talk about Francisco Madero. He is a very funny character, in my opinion. He's kind of like inadvertently causes a lot of the things to happen in this story, not really fully understanding a lot of things. He reminds me of a lot of politicians today that were like establishment liberals, but they were just super rich guys and supported Bernie Sanders. There were a lot of Maderos back then. So Madero is super rich. His family made a fortune during the American Civil War when the Confederacy had to start dealing in Mexico because the Union had closed up all these ports in the South. So they just jumped on it and they became part of the upper crust in Mexico. He got to go travel all around, went to all these Jesuit colleges and stuff. He traveled and studied in France, and he eventually went to UC Berkeley, where he got really into agricultural science and learned like homeopathy. So he became like this rich guy that goes around to his employees and is like, you should try this herb. And they're like, please help me. My hand was ripped off in a factory. And he's like, you just need to meditate, man. He's a spiritist.
Yeah, sort of like a Christian Scientist, or like I think about Kellogg in the U.S., sort of saying that like oatmeals and wheats, you could give yourself like oatmeal enema, or like take a bath in some grits, and it'll heal your body and mind and soul. So yeah, I feel like Madero's got his jumbled up weird ideas, and also his sense of class. The class he belongs to, he's porous, right?
Yeah, he's kind of like on Succession, like the brother that runs for president and is just goofy, and he thinks he's like a populist, but he's like a weird like libertarian and stuff. He's just got this very funny like disconnect that's a byproduct of his privilege. He's a spiritist, which like there's like an interesting like secular occult thing at the time. It's not considered super blasphemous in a lot of societies to be into like tarot cards and like Ouija boards and stuff. And he's really into this shit. And one of his main things is that he believed himself to be visited regularly by his brother Raul, who died as a child. So he says every so often he's visited by the ghost of his child brother, and he tells him stuff. And apparently,
this is not schizophrenia. This is just normal stuff.
Yeah, he's
my big beautiful mind, Madero.
Right. I mean, it's like a possible explanation here is that he just had a brain tumor or something, and like it caused the Mexican Revolution to happen. Because the way he tells it is that there was this thing that happened because like he is somewhat aware, he's kind of a bleeding heart, he's somewhat aware of like the corruption and stuff. So one of Diaz's really militant generals, Bernardo Reyes, crushed that liberal protest in Monterrey where he shot a bunch of students and stuff, right? When this happened, Francisco Madero went and talked to his ghost child, Raul, and Raul told him, it's your destiny to enter politics to fix this. So he's like, okay, I got to do what the ghost says. It's my destiny. He's talked to the universe and all this stuff. And so he goes and he runs for office and he loses. And he runs for president and he runs for governor and he runs for all this stuff. And he has all this money to do so. So he just keeps running for office and he keeps losing because he doesn't understand that democracy itself isn't really what it says it is. It's maybe not a fair playing field, but especially under the Porfiriato, if you run for office and you don't have the buy-in of Porfirio Diaz, you're not actually going to win. Like it's a crooked system on top of.
You need to be part of the boss machine, right? You got to be part of the boss machine. But Madero, I don't know, for the listeners, he is super significant because, to jump ahead, he is the first leader of the moderate leader of the successful Mexican Revolution, and now we're seeing him at the beginning of his dipping his toes into helping these radicals that are kind of not even where he would want to take things, because I think of him as more of a liberal than as he's an idealist that has hope in the electoral process.
Yeah, he's a total liberal. And that's why later
$50,000 to almost the people that are not aligned with him necessarily.
But that's the thing about liberals a lot of the times, is that we look at them and we see a distinction. They look at us and they do not see a distinction. They're like, I'm the left, I'm a leftist, right? You hear this all the time from people that are like, they say they're a leftist and they're like, you got to vote for Joe Biden or whatever. And you're okay, and I think that's what's going on here, is that he's reading Regeneracion and he says he loves it. He says, I really vibe with a lot of these ideas, and I say vibe because he's from 100 years ago, but he he sees them as critiques that are consistent with him. It's just they're also not really saying out loud what the prescription is. They're just doing the diagnosis at this point, that there's something wrong with this guy, and that he's corrupt and powerful, and there's a problem here. And so they managed to get, and this happens, you know, I mean, it happens all the time. But yeah, he gives them a bunch of money, and he becomes increasingly sympathetic to them. Also because he keeps losing against, you know, the Porfiriato, and I think he starts to realize, either because it's corruption or whatever, either because the system doesn't work, or just because he keeps getting beaten by them. He hates Porfirio Diaz now, and he's from the same class as Porfirio Diaz, but he hates them, and the only other people that hate Diaz are the radicals. So he's increasingly becoming like sympathetic to these people skittering around the valley and the border and stuff, and he's like, I think these are my guys, you know. So
it makes me think about like when George Bush was in power, or when Trump was in power the first time. It's so much easier to get a coalition of people who can identify what the problem is, but they have different solutions, right? So like it's in such stark contrast when it's a Republican in power. So then you will have liberals and communists and anarchists and socialists all lumped together. Even identity politics people all lumped together to think we're on the same page. And it's when you get somebody like Biden in power or Obama in power that you start seeing the policing of like true left ideas by the progressives and the liberals who want to shut you up and have you not complain. And we have less solidarity when we've got the wolf in sheep's clothing liberals in charge.
Yeah, because they then turn around and they go, this is what we wanted. We all want the same thing, and it was this. And if you disagree with me, you're being divisive and all this stuff. Whatever. We've all
you're into purity politics. You want to take it too far. You're too extreme. You don't want to play by the rules.
Yeah. I hate living under Trump, but like living under the Democrats is maddening for that reason in a different way. I'm like, at least everyone now is aware that something is wrong. But just when Biden was president, everything was, don't talk about politics anymore.
Under Republicans, we all are wearing the They Live glasses.
Yeah, we can see, consume.
And under the Dems, you are gaslit into being told that everything is fine when you are still wearing the glasses.
This is an excellent visual bit for anyone watching on YouTube. Gabe's been taking off and putting on sunglasses for the show, like a poker player. So, anyways, with the $2,000 he gives them, which again, $50,000 in today's money, they successfully relaunch Regeneración, this time north of the border, so from outside of Mexico, and now it's back in business. They're going to keep cooking. You can't stop them, right? Now it becomes this current shape. So let's talk about citizenship a little bit before we move on. In 1896, there was a court case in San Antonio in R.E. Rodriguez. I don't know, it's like Latin or something, in Ray Rodriguez. I'm not sure how court cases work. But basically, there was this guy named Ricardo Rodriguez who just walked into a courthouse and he applied for citizenship. And he's brown, like he's a Mexican dude. Yeah. And so the judge went, "Why do you want citizenship?" And he was like, "'Cause I live here." And it sparked this historical court case where people went, "Can he do that? Like, huh?" Because it just was understood you weren't a citizen if you were Mexican. But he said, "I fucking live here." And it kind of hadn't come up yet, really, legally. So what happened is there's these two lawyers who wanted to throw cold water on this, like, immediately, because they were frustrated. The establishment itself, capitalists, were frustrated with the fact that post-Mexican-American War, the Mexicans that lived in the part of the country that got ceded, they got citizenship. Made sense. It was part of the end of the war, the treaty that they established, and that gave a lot of that created a like voting blocks, especially in South Texas and the Valley, and they went Democrat. They for whatever reason, politics of the time, makes sense. Still kind of do up until recently. But the Democrats were able to pander to them as a voting bloc, and the Democrats, at this time are starting to do things that are a pain in the ass to certain parts of the ruling class. So these two lawyers are frustrated with that. So they argue that they go against him, and they argue that the Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted the rights to naturalize to free white men. That's the first naturalization law there is. And then the Civil War happened, and after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment gave like black Americans and former slaves citizenship. So really, you had black and white citizens and kind of no one else. And then in 1878, the Supreme Court ruled that Chinese immigrants are ineligible for citizenship because of all the Chinese labor stuff. And in 1880, they ruled that mixed white indigenous people, like mestizos, ineligible if you are not all the way white. So they're starting to carve out these, distinctions here. And this results in de facto Mexicans are not legally people, citizens or whatever in America. That's the argument these two lawyers make. But Rodriguez's lawyer brings up the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is the end of the Mexican-American War Treaty, and argues that it naturalized Mexicans, and we're Mexicans, even if we're, the next generation or whatever. How's that work? You can't just have like one naturalized generation and then the next generation not. So we grandfathered in all Mexicans from this point. And the judge goes, yeah, you got a point there. And so he wins. And this officially sort of ends racial barriers to naturalization because it creates sort of legal precedent, and now you can argue, well, they figured this out, so now it applies to Chinese or whatever, right?
Yeah, in the Chinese case, birthright citizenship comes from the Chinese case, Chinese American Wan Kim Ark, who was born in the U.S. and then went back to China and then came back, and they wouldn't let him in, and he had to stay on the boat for a while. And it was his case that, like, because he was born here, he was a citizen. And so that is led the precedent to everybody who's born in the U.S. To be a citizen right off the bat. And
it's interesting how these are, like, at this point in history, like 100 years ago, new ideas, like borders themselves and stuff like that, and traveling, and they're treated by people who want to protect them now as if they're these eternal concepts that have always existed, right? But we didn't even hadn't had this argument yet, really, in mass, in like on a government level, because it didn't really come up or matter. There isn't actually like scarcity that they sort of imply there is when people bring up like border crisis, quote unquote. We hadn't really gotten to the origins of the drug war just yet. That's coming up here right around the turn of the century. But that hadn't become like a scapegoat in all of this yet. So yeah, they just kind of went, okay, yeah, you're right. You got a point. You live here, right? So that lays the groundwork that now all of this is happening on top of, because they're going to start trying to use these laws against them, but they've just established citizenship. So the Magoon brothers and Juan Sarabia, whose cousin has showed up. I can't remember if I got to that yet. This is guy Manuel Sarabia. There's a lot of characters in like the squad here, and I'm not gonna have time to get to all of them. But Manuel Sarabia is with Juan and Magoon brothers, Enrique and Ricardo. They go to San Antonio, right? And they meet this guy Pablo Cruz. He's the publisher of El Regidor. Regidor. I don't know what the fuck that means. He welcomes them, and he invites them to speak at the 1904 16 Mexican Independence Day. 16 is commemoration of the Cry of Dolores, Father Hidalgo, the priest, back in 1810, when he sparked the Mexican War of Independence, the original one. He gave this, screed, right? It's called the Cry of Dolores, and it's like officially marks the Day of Mexican Independence. So people, redo it or whatever, perform it on 16. 16 is actually Mexican Independence Day. But the thing about that, it's fucked up. For a while, it was on the 15th, because the 15th of September is Porfirio Diaz's birthday. So his birthday is the 15th. Independence Day is the 16th. He's like, why don't we just do it all on my birthday? He's like a dictator. So he just changed Independence Day to the 15th for the Porfiriato.
Hell yeah, makes
So,
sense.
yeah, it's a very vain move on his part. I think it's very funny. So the brothers speak at the DACCS festival in San Antonio. There's this consul there, Enrique Ornelas. He reports back to Mariscal. And then on November 5th, 1904, the first Regeneración from North of the Border is dropped. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this is the first issue that's dropped after getting the Madero money. And they do all these fiery polemics and takedowns of Diaz and all these governors and stuff. The next issue is about the vice president, this guy Ramon Corral, and it's funny that his whole thing is funny because basically he's a very unlikable person. Everyone hates him. He has a bad personality, and this is actually why Porfirio Diaz picked him for vice president, because he knew people were going to try to assassinate him, and he's like, well, if I have a really unlikable vice president, maybe they won't, because then it's like, come on, you want him or whatever. And they
Like
the rebel writers, right? Yeah. I mean, Pence too. Like, I don't know. It's hard to tell if that was deliberate because they all suck. But
or when Obama had Biden.
Yeah, maybe. You know what? Maybe. Yeah. The Regeneración writes a screed against him, which no one really thought to do because of the strategy in play there. But they basically just said, take them both down. Shoot Pence first. That's a popular sign I saw in the first presidency of Donald Trump. And they said all these interesting things. They said, Diaz is not divine. He cannot be the nation. He calls us bad Mexicans, but we call ourselves patriots. And Diaz is a traitor to the nation. I think this is really interesting. Early Regeneración, where they call themselves patriots because they're not fully anarchists yet, because you can't really be a patriot and an anarchist at the same time. This is very liberal speak, right? And as they're writing all this stuff out of San Antonio, an armed man breaks into the Regeneración office and attempts to stab Ricardo in the back. And Enrique tackles him to the floor, and now they kick rocks again. They get the hell out of San Antonio, and they go to St. Louis. And no one really knows why they went to St. Louis.
All over the country, bro. All over the country.
Yeah, it's like a Looney Tunes map. You can see them running around or whatever. They would make a good road trip comedy because they're always on the road. I guess they're on horses or something. I don't know. So they flee to St. Louis, right? Or I guess they take trains. So no one really knows why they went to St. Louis, because there were not a lot of Mexican people in St. Louis at that time. It seems kind of odd. It's extremely racist at this point. It had just held a World's Fair where they held like black people and Filipinos on display like zoo animals, shit like that. They end up linking up with the Villarreal family. The Villarreal family, if I forgot to mention earlier, is their sisters Teresa and Andrea, and their brother Antonio. Antonio Villarreal will become a really close Magonista for the rest of the story. He's a professor. He's a man of letters. And he had just got out of 4 years in prison for killing a man in a duel. And they say the duel started over a literary dispute. So he's a real character, this one, right? He's like, you said Oscar Wilde said what? Prepare to die. And then they get into a duel. And the thing is, duels still happened in Mexico City.
If you can't resolve it with the pen, you got to move to the pistol.
You have to take it outside. Apparently there were duels still, and they didn't really get prosecuted, but he was also a liberal. So they just used it as a way to throw him in prison because he was critical of Porfirio Diaz. So he became extra angry while he was in prison for 4 years. He gets out and I'm joining the damn Magonistas, right? So there's a spy who's spying on them at this point, and he says that the writers, although many worked as managers and editors and stuff like that, I think Juan Sarabia is like the editor at this point, or Enrique is the editor. Juan Sarabia is a vice president or some shit. I don't know. The main guys are like kind of the core all the time. But the point being is that everyone, in addition to working on Regeneración, had social lives, even in racist ass St. Louis, right? So they went to carnivals, They went to bars. They chatted up women. The women went out and did stuff, except for Ricardo. A spy that reported back to Diaz said that Ricardo, he just wrote and wrote and wrote, man. He just hunched over that typewriter. And the spy called him El Alma de Todo, the soul of the revolution, or the soul of all of it, right? That became like his infamous nickname in the Diaz regime. And they said, he's the soul, man. If you end it, if you get rid of him, if you throw him in jail, it ends all of it, because the rest of these are just people. And it's true. Like, he will not stop. He will not back down. He will not compromise. Everyone eventually kind of pulls an Arriaga and goes, I'm done. Or like a Jesus, his brother, where he's like, I'm getting out of this, he just will not stop. And they recognize that, because he's just a bull, man. He's the soul of the rev.
Locked in.
He's locked in today's terms. Yeah. So in St. Louis, Magone meets famous Spanish anarchist Florencio Basora, who I don't know much about, but I'm going to look into. This is interesting. But he also meets none other than Emma Goldman, right?
Oh,
famous anarchist from history, the queen of anarchy, they call her. Which is also kind of a paradox. Or a, what do you call it? Oxymoron. But he meets Emma Goldman, and shortly after meeting Goldman, Goldman published one of her like seminal works. It's called What I Believe. That's where she outlines a lot of her anarchist philosophy. And she's an interesting character. She's a rebel for sure. In 1903, anarchists had been banned from immigration by Congress. This is after that. She's still there. She doesn't care, right? She eventually gets deported in like the Red Raids, leading up to World War I, the Great War. And in What I Believe, she talks about her theory of anarchism and posits that it's a process, not a goal. She's not a utopian. She says, communists are too utopian. You're working towards this end thing. Anarchism is what you're doing here and now all the time. It's a very interesting thing that I think when people get really into the authoritarian theory of communism, they lose a little bit of the real world you actually live in. The mutual aid comes out of a lot of this thinking. A lot of the things that are help keeping people alive right now. This is Emma Goldman. This is anarchism. She also attacks the concept of marriage, which, like I said earlier, hadn't come up with a lot of other strains of socialism and stuff like that. And she starts to really deconstruct the patriarchy, which is a thing that not a lot of these male anarchists and socialists and communists had really gotten to yet. Engels, arguably, but whatever. Magone later wrote about her, and he said, she does not come with roses or caresses. She comes with an axe. It's pretty metal, right? Magone's feminism seems to have been insufficient. It's been criticized retroactively by feminists. This is a topic of dispute. It's tough to say, because a lot of what he was saying at this point was not really quite his entire philosophy. But people have pointed out that Regeneración published some things that, maybe we rejected marriage, sure, but also still kind of subjugated women in the revolution to the service of the men in the revolution and stuff like that. So maybe was not as much of a feminist as he thought he was, still hadn't really made these hadn't figured this stuff out in his head. Possible we're dealing with, a person in the past, so can't 100% stake out, but obviously we should be critical of these people. And some of the shit he says later on, particularly when he's mad at someone, you could cherry pick and go, I think this guy's homophobic or misogynistic or whatever. We'll get to these later, but it's hard to say. So I don't know. I think that it's important to note that there's like inklings of kind of understanding the patriarchy in his writing, and then there's also probably limits to it, because he's an angry, dumb guy in a lot of ways.
We can also say, within the literary and intellectual, bouillabaisse that he's swimming in, there are these extremely radical feminists, anarchists, and poets and thinkers that he's rubbing shoulders with that Porfirio Diaz certainly wasn't, right? Or like the other side. So he is, he brought up anarchism being like a progress, right? It's a work in progress. And we see his evolution over time as well. He is taking in these ideas, and they're, all of us have sort of unexamined biases in our own lives, right? Or like the ideology that we swim in is the water that we swim in. So as fish, like we don't know that we're wet, right? Like, right. So he's all of us have to do this work of deprogramming our biases in ourselves. And their gender stuff was baked into the way they were born and raised in Mexican society. So he's dismantling it. It's like building the plane while it's in the air.
If I was a fish, I would know I was wet, but I'd be the only one. Yeah. So I don't know. I think this is an interesting kind of question to ask here, but I guess I like him a lot, although I think he's certainly, deserving of criticism. And, I mean, even his friends, although this is their point of view, a lot of them said that he was not the smartest of them. He was just like the best of them in a lot of ways. Like he just wouldn't stop. He's like he's the soul, right? Although those are people who disagree with him about certain things. So smart, what does that mean to them? I don't know. I think, I mean, we'll get to why this is confusing in a minute. So no, that's actually the next thing. So Magone, here's the thing. He is starting to become increasingly anarchist, right? Like I said last episode, he loved Kropotkin. He meets Emma Goldman. He's starting to have this divide with Arriaga, and eventually they split, and he writes a polemic, whatever. This is leftist history. There's always a polemic. Everyone's, got to denounce their ex-friend or whatever. And for a long time forward, though, he gets into this conversation with the rest of the writers of Generacion, even though he's like the editor-in-chief, where they kind of say like, hey man, like, we get that you're an anarchist now. We get that you've evolved into an anarchist. Maybe don't write that word in the paper, which I think is really interesting because they've already fled to like another country, but he agrees not to really say it out loud. And I think what's going on here is not so much that they're worried that they'll get in trouble for it. It's that they are propagandists and they don't want to alienate their readers because they realize that, anarchists are associated with assassinations and stuff like that. And they're in the situation that we often find ourselves in as leftists here, where we go, there's a taboo. You're going to lose people if you use the word. So what if you just say everything except the word and then get people to agree with you, and then later on you can go, surprise, you're an anarchist, right? Or you're a communist or whatever.
Violence is never a legitimate form of political discourse. Violence is never the answer, Jake. And these words, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, communist, anarchist, those are so extreme. I mean, can't we just deal with we just want peace?
What Luigi Mangione allegedly did would it have been wrong? So I don't know if I 100% agree, like at this point in history, 100 years later, with where we're at, whether you shouldn't say the words like this. But I mean, for whatever reason, it was their strategy, and I think it worked. It had the effect of spreading consciousness without coming with the taboo that may have, been easier to manipulate by the Porfiriato, right? The Porfiriato kind of like it accused them often of being revolutionaries, and they juked around that like rhetorically a lot, which is interesting because they were, but they would say, they turn it around and go, why would anyone need to be a revolutionary? Huh? Why? What about that? They just, so I don't know. These things are often tactical and specific to their historical context, but for whatever reason, he's a secret anarchist, and that's why it's also hard to understand what he really meant when you read his writing from this time, because it's veiled through trying to reach people. We're almost to the finish line here. So Generacion becomes so popular that Diaz's regime has to convince the U.S. post office to crack down by administering a huge fee to mail it. They manipulated some kind of trade thing there, and that will effectively end their ability to publish Generacion. So what they do is they sneak it through the mail using Sears canisters, right? So there's no propaganda in here. This is just a Sears catalog or whatever, and they have this whole network set up to where they get it to couriers south of the border, and these couriers know that they'll be arrested if they are heard saying the name Magon at this point. He's such an ominous villain to the Mexican government. Stuffed a bunch of copies under his shirt and he just walked around like that, like, I'm just fat, don't look at me, and then he handed out Generacion. He said he did it because Generacion lit a dream
Omar
within
from
him
The Wire.
to not be extinct. Yeah, yeah. Or that shit where you like
remember that scene in The Wire where he's in prison, he's in jail, and they think they're gonna they want to assassinate him, so he just duct tapes a bunch of phone books to his chest to create like a bulletproof vest, a shit-proof vest. And so I just imagine this courier just dressed up as like a fucking Mexican Santa Claus, all poofy with like hundreds and hundreds of pamphlets duct taped to his chest. I also can't believe that
coolest guy in town, in my opinion.
Reverse smuggling, getting things from the U.S. to Mexico, right? The irony there, and also that the Postal Service was the enemy of the Mexican U.S. Postal Service being the enemy of the Mexican Revolution. And I imagine like a bunch of Charles Bukowskis working in the mailroom being like, oh, I got to look out for Magonist literature. I just want to go home and drink and write.
The Postal Service plays a major role after this a little bit because it's kind of like constructed around this time. It kind of comes up and it's crazy. They fight a war through the mail. It's so cool. But that'll be for a future episode, probably the next one, I think. So before we end here, let's talk about the PLM a little bit. They eventually form a political party. It's called the Partido Liberal Mexicano, and it's forming, but alongside at the same time, they're starting to form what are called focos, or revolutionary cells, for the coming days. So this anarchist liberal like dual thing is happening where they're making the party, but they're also putting together the syndicate, right? The cells. And there's another local consul that comes after them for slandering a jefe politico in Oaxaca, and he arrests Juan Sarabia, Ricardo, and Enrique, the main three, and they arrest them because of what they wrote in Generacion about this guy, which is they called him the horse of Attila, sowing destruction wherever it went, and insinuated that he offered sex with his wife in exchange for favors from the governor. I don't know. So again, their papers are seized, printing press is confiscated, and for a moment, Magon could not make his $900 bail, or his $500 bail rather, and he's stuck in jail. And they think, man, they might have got him because they got him on a really high bail this time. And the Focos are organizing out there, and the party's coming together, but their leader is gone, and no one really knows exactly how he got out. But it seems pretty much like what happened is, right after he got out, he wrote a telegram to Francisco Madero thanking him for the $900 he sent. So because of this link they have with Madero through Arriaga, saved his life and he got out of jail, right? And this time they skip bail and they're like, fuck it, we're what do you call it? We're on the run now, we're on the lam. And they scatter, and let's see. Rivera and the Villarreal sisters held things down in St. Louis. Manuel and Antonio rode around the border, recruiting PLM members and FOCO leaders. And the three amigos, Magon, Sarabia, they fled north to Toronto. They scattered all the way to Canada at this point.
And they joined Second City.
Yep. The third generation. Things were once again in disarray, but on June 1st, 1906, a labor strike escalated to violence an American-owned copper mine in Cananea, Mexico, and the junta came prepared to declare war on the Diaz regime. But that is where we'll pick up next time. It's the labor strike.
Hell yeah. So we're getting to some really cool stuff now. We've started organizing into a legitimate political party, the PLM, which is pretty cool. And then the idea of the Focos is also interesting. And when we think about like anarchist organizing, it being sort of collapsing things into like horizontal structures rather than hierarchical. You know, that's the way I look at it versus sort of like a more centrally organized communist approach to government. It's like having little cells. And I saw this really cool meme about you can have a protest, and if you have a protest with like 100, let's say 50,000 people in one place, and everybody knows it's happening there, then it's easier for the system to like control that, police it, suppress it. But if you have 10 simultaneous protests of 1,000 people in different parts of the city, it's going to shut down everything. Right. So like the Focos kind of remind me of that, sort of these independent cells all operating, opposed to having one centralized army with like one general in charge.
Be like water. It's a Bruce Lee
man.
quote that
Go,
often comes up.
Yeah, you know, the Maoists, they played Go. When you look at China versus the way that Europe was focused on games like chess, right? In chess, you've got one king, and you just got to capture that king. But in Go, you know, you're fluid. You're all over the board, you know?
Yeah. And it reflects that way of thinking for sure. I got to play Go. It's come up lately in my life. I'm going to have to learn soon. Okay. Listen, I'm going to put a pin in here. I was going to read some stuff. I've got more notes. This is going to just have to be how we do this because, the notes I'm taking are so thorough because this is so interesting to me, but we're at 2 hours. So I'm going to cut it and we're going to bounce. Thank you, Gabe, again for joining us. Gabe Pacheco, where can people check you out, listen to your cool podcast and all that stuff?
Oh, man. Find me on Instagram at Gabepac1, Gabepac, and the number 1. And the podcast is HALAL CARTELS. And if you're in New York City, Nueva York, you can come and visit me every Wednesday night at Pete's Candy Store at 10 p.m. for Funhouse Comedy. And it's we've been running it for 10 years. I've been hosting this live stand-up comedy show with my partner, Samir Nassim, for 10 years at Pete's Candy Store. But you can hear Samir and I on HALAL CARTELS.
All right. And if you enjoy our show, please consider signing up for our Patreon, where you can hang out with us in the Discord and get bonus episodes every week. We just did the Battle for Algiers, the movie. And it's how we make the show. It's how we bring this 2-hour long ass podcast to you without ads or anything like that. So please, even if you don't want to hear the content, just throw me a few dollars because that's how we keep things cooking. Yeah, I think I have a show. Look at my social media. I don't know. It's at Feral Jokes if you don't know that. I have some stuff coming up here in Los Angeles, and I just started a podcast with one of the library punks. It's called The Preacher and the Slave. We're watching the show Preacher. I have a million podcasts. My other show, Why You Mad, with our friend Louisa. And yeah, that's it for now. Okay, thank you. And it's finito. I don't know what the fuck I'm saying. Bye, it's finished.